Have you ever witnessed an interview where respect is trampled upon and self-esteem is challenged? In the unpredictable world of entertainment, there was a moment that shook millions of hearts when Morgan Freeman, an icon of wisdom and composure, faced a rude talk show host. Would he maintain his composure in the face of malicious questions? Or would there be an emotional explosion on live television? Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow we'll bring you another inspiring story created just for you. Join us as we explore this emotional story where true values are honored and the power of kindness is strongly demonstrated. How will Morgan Freeman respond to the disrespect? The answer will leave you speechless. The story begins. In the studio, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. All the seats were packed, millions of people watching from home, eager to hear the wisdom of Morgan Freeman, the man whose voice has told stories of a lifetime. At the age of 86, he remains sharp, elegant, and respected as ever. He walked onto the stage slowly, his familiar deep voice greeting the audience. People applauded, some even wiping away tears. But as he sat down in his chair, something felt off. The host, Eleanor Clark, is a well-known figure in the talk show world. Bold, ruthless, and often disrespectful. Morgan had been in many interviews, but tonight would be different. She leaned forward, her red lips curling into a smirk. "So, Morgan," she said, her voice smooth but sharp, "at your age, do you ever wake up and wonder if today might be your last?" The room fell silent. The audience's smiles vanished. Morgan didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands on his lap and looked at her. A storm was coming, and Eleanor had no idea what she had just started. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some exchanging glances, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Eleanor chuckled as if the question was harmless. Morgan Freeman remained silent, those eyes, those wise, knowing eyes, looking at her. Eleanor didn't stop. "He once played God," she continued, tilting her head. "But let's be real, you're just a man. A very old man. How does it feel knowing your time is running out?" A few gasps echoed. An old woman in the front row put her hand over her chest. Morgan let out a soft sigh, shaking his head. He had been in Hollywood for decades. He had witnessed arrogance masking cruelty and disrespect. But this was different. Eleanor was reveling in it. The cameras zoomed in on Morgan's face, his expression unreadable. But inside, he was thinking, reflecting. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every senior citizen watching, about every soul that has been discarded, disrespected, treated as if they no longer mattered. And so, when he finally spoke, the world listened. Morgan leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice steady but sharp, "have you ever sat beside someone as they took their last breath?" The question sent shivers through the audience. Eleanor blinked. She hadn't expected that. "Well, she stammered, but Morgan didn't let her finish. "I have," he said softly many times. The room fell silent. Morgan's voice carried the weight of 1,000 memories. "I've held the hands of dear friends as they whispered their final words." He continued, "I've watched great men and women take their last breath. And you know what their biggest regret was?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "They never wished for more money or fame. They wished they had loved more, forgiven more, cherished life more." The cameras panned across the audience. Some were already in tears. Morgan looked deep into Eleanor's soul. "You ask me how it feels to be old," he said. "It feels like a privilege that many don't get." The audience erupted, some standing up to applaud through their tears. But Morgan wasn't finished yet. As for Eleanor, for the first time in her career, she was speechless. Eleanor Clark sat motionless, clutching her note cards as if they were the only things keeping her grounded. The studio was silent. The audience held its breath. Morgan Freeman's words still hung in the air like an unshakable truth. "It feels like a privilege that many don't get." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman wiped away tears, A man perhaps in his 70s clenched his fist as if remembering a lost loved one. Eleanor tried to smile, but it came out shaky. Well, Morgan, you're quite the storyteller, but let's be real, people your age, they start to become irrelevant in Hollywood, don't they? Gasps rippled through the audience. Morgan sighed, leaning back in his chair. He rubbed his fingers together, a habit he had when he was thinking. He looked at Eleanor, not with anger, not with offense, but with pity. Then he spoke. My dear, let me tell you a story. The audience leaned forward. Morgan Freeman was about to speak, and when Morgan Freeman spoke, you listened. Once upon a time, Morgan began. His voice thick with emotion. There was a young man. He was full of dreams, full of life. He thought the world would always be his, but time has a way of humbling us. The room remained silent. One day, that young man grew old. He found that the world that once applauded him had moved on. They didn't see him anymore. They didn't listen to him anymore. A woman in the audience covered her mouth, tears welling up. But one night, Morgan continued. He sat by his window and watched a storm roll in. And he realized something. Eleanor swallowed hard. He realized that even when the sky grows dark, even when the world seems to have forgotten the sun is still there, still burning, still shining, even behind the clouds. A sniffle echoed. Then another. Morgan looked at Eleanor with kind eyes. So you see, my dear, he said softly, irrelevant is a word that the world tries to pin on those who have lived long enough to carry wisdom. But wisdom never fades. Eleanor's lips parted slightly as if to say something, but for the first time in her career, she had nothing to say. The cameras swept across the audience, an elderly man wiping his face with a handkerchief, a young girl sitting with her grandmother clutching her hand. People weren't just watching, they were feeling. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably, clearing her throat. That was quite a speech, Morgan. Morgan smiled gently. Wasn't a speech, Eleanor, it was the truth. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor smirked. Let's talk about something else. She glanced at her note card. Your childhood, she said, your mother was a cleaner, your father left when you were young. Tell me, Morgan, have you ever resented having to climb so much higher than others? The audience tensed. It was a cruel question, but Morgan just smiled, because he knew what was coming. And when he finally spoke, the world would never forget. Eleanor's words hung in the air like a knife. His father left when he was young. Did he ever resent it? The audience was silent. Morgan Freeman sat quietly, his eyes deep, thoughtful. 86 years of wisdom lay in his silence. Eleanor smirked, thinking she had finally pushed him to his breaking point. But Morgan, he just smiled. Then, in his legendary voice, he spoke. My father left, yes, and my mother was a cleaner, but do I resent it? No, Eleanor, I thank them. The audience leaned forward. Morgan's voice was even, but there was an unshakable strength in it. My father taught me something valuable. He taught me the kind of man I didn't want to be. And my mother, he paused, his eyes lighting up with emotion. She taught me how to survive. A woman in the audience quietly sobbed. Eleanor blinked. This wasn't the reaction she was expecting. Morgan leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. You see, Eleanor, pain is a teacher, and it has taught me well. The room was silent, because once again, Morgan Freeman had turned pain into wisdom. A sniffle echoed. In the audience, then another. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. The atmosphere had changed. Morgan Freeman, a man who had experienced pain, endured loss, and survived the impossible, was sitting across from her, not as a victim, but as a victor. You ask me if I resent my past, he continued softly. The truth is, I carry it with me every day, but not as a burden. He paused, his deep voice filling the room with emotion. I carry it as a reminder that I am still here. An elderly man in the front row bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. A woman whispered, "Oh my God, that's beautiful." Morgan sighed, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest of his chair. The problem with the world today, Eleanor, is that too many people look at their past and feel bitter. But I look at my past and I feel grateful. The audience erupted in applause, some openly weeping. Eleanor bit her lip, losing control of the interview. She hadn't expected this, and she certainly wasn't prepared for what Morgan would say next. Eleanor took a deep breath. She was losing control of this interview. She had planned to make Morgan Freeman uncomfortable. She had planned to take him down, but instead, she was the one who was shaken. Regaining her composure, she straightened her shoulders, trying to regain the upper hand. "Morgan," she said with a forced confidence, "don't you ever feel afraid? I mean, you're 86 years old, you've had an incredible career, but time doesn't stop for anyone." A cruel question, but Morgan simply smiled. Then he leaned forward, and what he said next moved the world. "Eleanor," he said softly, "do you know the difference between fear and faith?" The audience was silent. Eleanor blinked. Morgan's voice was like a warm embrace. "Fear," he said, "is believing in the worst that can happen. Faith is believing in the best." Tears streamed down a woman's face. "Every morning," Morgan continued, "I wake up and I choose faith." Eleanor swallowed hard. The power in his words was undeniable, and for the first time in her career, she had nothing to say. For the first time in her career, Eleanor Clark was speechless. Morgan Freeman had just spoken a kind of truth, the kind of truth that pierces the soul. Fear is believing in the worst that can happen. Faith is believing in the best. The audience was in turmoil, some covering their mouths trying to contain their emotions, others weeping openly. Eleanor looked around, visibly shaken. She had expected to control the conversation. She had expected to put him on the defensive. Instead, he had turned the entire interview into something bigger than himself. The cameras zoomed in on an old woman in the front row, tears streaming down her face. Morgan noticed her. He gave her a warm smile. "You understand, don't you?" he asked softly. The woman nodded, her hand trembling as she whispered, "Yes." Morgan turned back to Eleanor. "You see, Eleanor, wisdom isn't about age, it's about perspective. And the moment you learn to embrace life instead of fearing its end, that's when you truly live." The room erupted, people applauding through tears, and Eleanor, for the first time, she was afraid of what was to come. Eleanor shifted in her seat. She was losing control, and she knew it. Her producers were watching from the control room, probably wondering why she hadn't cut him off yet. But she had no choice. This moment belonged to Morgan Freeman. Desperate to regain some control, she forced a laugh. "All right, Morgan," she said, "enough with the wisdom, let's talk about legacy. What do you think people will remember about you when you're gone?" The room fell silent again. It was a cold, direct question, but Morgan, he simply smiled gently. "Well, Eleanor," he said, shaking his head, "you're asking the wrong question." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" Morgan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The question isn't what people will remember about me when I'm gone," he said. "The question is what they'll remember about you." Eleanor froze. The audience gasped in unison. This was no longer an interview, this was a judgment, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor Clark felt small. She stared at him. The cameras, the lights, the audience, it all faded away. Morgan's words hit her like a ton of bricks. "The question is what they'll remember about you." Eleanor had always been the one asking the tough questions, the cruel questions, but now she was the one being forced to look inward. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Morgan leaned back, giving her space. His eyes were kind but sharp. "You see, Eleanor," he said softly, "I've spent my life telling stories, helping people feel, helping them understand. And when my time comes, I know I'll leave behind something meaningful." The audience listened in rapt silence. "You, on the other hand," he paused, "you have a platform, a powerful platform, but you use it to tear people down." A choked sob came from somewhere in the crowd. Eleanor looked down, clutching her note cards. Morgan sighed, his voice gentler. "But it's not too late," he said, "you can still choose a different path." A tear rolled down Eleanor's cheek, and in that moment, the world saw her break. Eleanor sat motionless, her fingers trembling slightly. For the first time in her career, she was exposed. Morgan Freeman's words hadn't just hit her, they had pierced her soul. "The question isn't what people will remember about me when I'm gone. The question is what they'll remember about you." The studio was silent, but inside Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind. She had built a career by tearing others down, asking the questions no one dared to ask. But in this moment, she had no answers. A tear slipped down her cheek. Morgan noticed. He sighed and then spoke in a deep, gentle voice. You see, Eleanor, people think strength comes from how loud they can speak, but true strength, real strength comes from knowing when to listen. A woman in the audience wept openly. Eleanor bowed her head, her breath trembling, because for the first time she was being forced to listen, and it was breaking her. The audience was stunned. This wasn't the Eleanor Clark they knew. She was always in control, always dominating the conversation, but now she looked small, vulnerable, human. A tear fell onto her note card. Morgan's eyes softened. Eleanor, he said gently, you've spent years sitting across from people, asking them the tough questions, but have you ever sat with yourself and asked yourself those same questions? She took a shaky breath, trying to stop herself from crying. She had spent years exposing others, but now she was the one being exposed. She whispered, her voice cracking. Morgan leaned forward, his voice like a father speaking to his child. It's never too late, he said. Eleanor closed her eyes tightly. A deep sob escaped her lips, and in that moment, the world watched Eleanor Clark break down on live television. The whole world was watching, millions at home, the audience in the studio, the producers in the control room. Eleanor Clark, one of the most fearsome interviewers on television, was crying. Not out of shame, not out of embarrassment, but because Morgan Freeman had forced her to confront herself. The cameras captured her face, raw and vulnerable. She whispered again. She shook her head. I don't know if I like what they'll remember about me. Morgan smiled gently. Then, my dear, he said softly, change the story. A gasp rippled through the audience. Someone clapped, then another. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, but this time not of defeat, but of awakening. And in that moment, the world witnessed something they would never forget. Eleanor Clark sat in silence, tears still wet on her face, hands trembling, mind racing. The whole world had just witnessed her transformation. Morgan Freeman hadn't shamed her. He hadn't attacked her. He had saved her. She took a deep breath, and then for the first time in her career, she asked a question, not from arrogance, but from humility. Morgan, she whispered, if you could tell the world just one thing before you left this earth, what would it be? The audience leaned forward. Morgan paused for a long moment. He looked at Eleanor, then at the crowd, then up, almost as if he was speaking to God himself. Finally, he smiled. My dear, he said softly, life is not measured by the number of years we live, but by the love we give. Someone sobbed loudly in the audience. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the words sink into her soul. It wasn't just an answer, it was the truth. The studio was silent for a moment, then a clap, then another, and suddenly the whole audience was on their feet. People were crying openly, some hugging strangers beside them, others just standing, hands over their hearts. Even the crew were wiping away tears. Eleanor was overwhelmed, her hand over her chest. Morgan, you've just changed my life. Morgan chuckled, his voice warm and rich. No, my dear, he said, you changed it yourself. The applause grew louder. The energy in the room shifted. This was no longer a talk show, it was a historical moment. A moment no one could ever forget. Morgan Freeman stood up slowly, the audience still applauding. He nodded gently to Eleanor, a look of understanding. Then he turned to the crowd. My friends, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I have lived many years, I have seen pain, I have seen loss, but I have also seen something more powerful than all of those things. He paused, looking at the tear-stained faces before him. I have seen love. A wave of emotion swept through the room. Morgan smiled. So if you leave here with anything tonight, let it be this. Go home, call the person you love, forgive the person you're angry with, tell the people who matter that they matter. A woman in the front row burst into sobs. Eleanor covered her mouth, fighting back her own tears. Morgan turned to her one last time. You asked me what my legacy would be, he said softly. It's this. And with that, he walked off the stage, leaving a world forever changed. This story is a profound reminder of the power of kindness, gratitude, and forgiveness. Have you ever had the chance to change someone's life with your kindness? Have you ever forgiven someone and felt a weight lifted off your shoulders? Share your story in the comments. Your voice can inspire others and contribute to making a better world. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family to spread the message of kindness, gratitude, and forgiveness. Thank you for watching and supporting. Let's work together to build a society where everyone is loved and respected. Wishing you peace and happiness. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe for the latest updates. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the help of AI. If there are any errors, please forgive them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.